Berlin, April 23, 1945. A German sergeant named Hermann Graf, 22 years old, veteran of Kursk and the retreat through Poland, crouches behind the remains of what was once a pharmacy on the Frankfurter Allee. In his hands, a Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle, its stock cracked, its magazine half empty. Around him, 7 men. 3 of them are boys, 16, perhaps 17 years old, pulled from school 2 weeks ago and handed rifles they have barely learned to load. To the east, the sound is not artillery anymore. It is something continuous, something geological. The grinding of Soviet armor advancing street by street through a city that is ceasing to exist. Graf looks at the boys. He has nothing to tell them that is true and also kind. He says nothing. To understand the final collapse of the Wehrmacht in the spring of 1945, you must understand what kind of army it had become by the time that spring arrived. It was not the Wehrmacht of 1940, that precise, confident instrument that had shattered France in 6 weeks and driven the British Army into the sea at Dunkirk. It was not even the Wehrmacht of 1943, still capable at Kursk of assembling the largest tank concentration in the history of warfare, still capable of coherent strategic thought, still able to field men who believed, however incorrectly, that the war could be influenced by their sacrifices. By January 1945, the Wehrmacht was something else entirely. It was an army being held together by institutional momentum, by terror, and by the particular human tendency to keep moving, because stopping means thinking, and thinking means acknowledging the truth. The numbers tell part of the story. Germany had lost, by conservative estimates, over 3 million military dead by the end of 1944. The replacement army, the system designed to feed trained soldiers into frontline units, had been gutted repeatedly to fill gaps that could not be filled. What came through the pipeline in 1945 was increasingly whatever could be found. Men too old, boys too young, soldiers with medical exemptions that were now being ignored, Volkssturm militia with 8 weeks of training and First World War bolt-action rifles that their grandfathers might have recognized. The officer corps was similarly hollowed out. The brilliant operational minds that had defined early Wehrmacht success, men like Heinz Guderian, Erich von Manstein, Erwin Rommel, were dismissed, wounded, killed, or reduced to impotence by a command structure that ran increasingly through Adolf Hitler's bunker and out into a world that no longer corresponded to any map or any rational military assessment. Hitler, by early 1945, was issuing orders to divisions that no longer existed, demanding counterattacks from armies that had no fuel, insisting on holding cities that were already surrounded. His generals knew. They briefed him with figures that were accurate. He replaced them with figures that were not, and found generals willing to present those instead. The result was an army fighting 2 converging catastrophes simultaneously, the physical destruction being imposed from outside by the Allied and Soviet armies closing from both directions, and the institutional destruction being imposed from inside by a command system that had severed its connection to reality. Into this situation, in the first week of January 1945, came the final act. The East, the Vistula-Oder Offensive. On January 12, 1945, Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front launched the Vistula-Oder Offensive, one of the most powerful military operations in the history of land warfare. The numbers were overwhelming. 563 kilometers of front, over 2 million Soviet soldiers, 6,000 tanks. The Red Army had spent the autumn of 1944 preparing this assault with a methodical, industrial thoroughness that reflected how completely it had transformed from the catastrophes of 1941. Artillery density reached 300 guns per kilometer of front at the breakthrough points, a concentration of firepower so intense that survivors described the ground itself seeming to shake not in individual explosions, but in one continuous, undifferentiated tremor that had no beginning and no end. The German Army Group A, commanded by Colonel General Josef Harp, and then rapidly by Ferdinand Schörner, after Hitler sacked Harp for the retreat, simply could not hold. It had been holding a front of roughly the same length with 17 divisions where the Soviet plan called for overwhelming those positions with forces 12 times larger. The line broke in hours, not days, hours. Soviet T-34-85 tanks, the upgraded variant that had appeared in large numbers by 1944, mounting an 85mm gun capable of killing a T-1 Tiger at combat ranges, poured through the gaps. The IS-2 heavy tank, with its devastating 122mm gun, led assault columns that nothing in the Wehrmacht's remaining arsenal could reliably stop from the front. The Panzerfaust, the single-shot rocket launcher that had become the primary German anti-tank weapon in the war's final years, could kill a T-34 at close range, but it required a man to be close enough to use it, and it gave that man one shot. The retreat became a rout. The rout became something beyond military description. Civilian columns mixed with military ones on the frozen roads heading west. German families who had lived in Prussia and Silesia for generations joined the collapse, fleeing what they understood correctly was coming behind the Soviet advance. The temperatures in January 1945 in that region dropped to -25 Celsius. Horses died in the traces. Vehicles ran out of fuel and were abandoned. People froze, standing in columns that had simply stopped moving because there was nowhere to move to. General Oberst Guderian, chief of the Army General Staff, a man who had been arguing with Hitler for months about the deteriorating situation with a directness that repeatedly brought him to the edge of dismissal, formally requested permission to withdraw the Army Group Vistula to defensible lines. Hitler refused. The Army Group fought on and was consumed. By February 1945, the Soviet spearheads had reached the Oder River, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. They paused there, consolidating, resupplying, preparing for what everyone understood was coming. For the German soldiers on the East Bank, that pause was not relief. It was simply the specific horror of waiting.
The West, the Rhine and the Ruhr Pocket. On the Western Front, the situation was equally irreversible, if somewhat less immediately apocalyptic in character. The Allied crossing of the Rhine, Operation Plunder, launched by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group on the night of March 23-24, 1945, was the largest amphibious river crossing in military history, involving over 80,000 men crossing on the first night alone. American forces under General Omar Bradley had already crossed at Remagen on March 7th, when the Ludendorff Bridge was found miraculously intact and seized by elements of the 9th Armored Division before German engineers could demolish it. Once across the Rhine, the Allied armies moved with a speed that the Wehrmacht's remaining forces could not meaningfully contest. The fuel situation for German armor was, by this point, catastrophic. The Panther and Tiger tanks that remained, and there were far fewer of each than at any previous point in the war, were often immobilized for lack of petrol, their crews forced to abandon vehicles that were mechanically intact. A panzer crew blowing up a functional Tiger for lack of 100 liters of fuel encapsulates the Wehrmacht's situation in those final weeks as precisely as any statistic. The Ruhr encirclement, completed by April 1, 1945, trapped German Army Group B under Field Marshal Walter Model in a pocket containing approximately 300,000 men, the largest surrender of German forces on the Western Front. Model, who had spent years as Hitler's preferred crisis manager, the man Hitler called his best field marshal, refused to surrender formally. He dissolved Army Group B, telling his men to make their own way as best they could. Then, on April 21, 1945, in a forest near Duisburg, Walter Model shot himself. He was 54 years old. Berlin, the final battle. The Soviet assault on Berlin began on April 16, 1945, with an artillery bombardment of such intensity that it was heard, not felt, heard over 100 kilometers away. Zhukov's forces attacked across the Silo Heights, a ridge overlooking the Oder floodplain that the Germans had fortified with everything that remained. The battle for the heights lasted 3 days and cost the Soviets approximately 30,000 dead, a reminder that even a dying Wehrmacht fighting for ground it understood was the last ground could still exact a terrible price. By April 21st, Soviet forces were inside Berlin's outer defensive ring. By April 25th, the city was completely encircled. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 10,000 artillery pieces, over 6,000 tanks, all focused on a city of rubble defended by perhaps 85,000 combatants of wildly varying quality, mixed with Volkssturm militia, Hitler Youth pressed into anti-tank roles, SS units fighting with the ferocity of men who understood their crimes had made surrender impossible, and ordinary soldiers who simply had nowhere else to go. The fighting was street by street, building by building, floor by floor. Soviet infantry advanced behind T-34s that fired point-blank into building facades before troops entered. German defenders used Panzerfausts at ranges of 20 meters, suicidally close, often fatal to the user as well as the target. The Tiergarten became a battlefield. The subway tunnels filled with wounded, with civilians, with the terrified remnants of a city that cheered this war's beginning and now was consuming its ending. In the Führer bunker, 50 meters below the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler moved phantom armies across maps on April 22nd, then collapsed into a breakdown when told those armies were not coming, then rallied into a final fury, then subsided into the specific quietness of a man who has made his decision. On April 30th, 1945, he shot himself. Eva Braun, whom he had married the previous day, took cyanide beside him. The city fought on for 2 more days after its leader's death, not from any strategic purpose, but from the specific inertia of men who had been fighting so long that stopping required a conscious act of will that the fighting itself had made difficult to perform. On May 2nd, 1945, the Berlin garrison surrendered. General Helmuth Weidling, the city's last commander, signed the capitulation order and walked into Soviet captivity. He would die there in a prison camp in Vladimir in 1955. The battle for Berlin lasted 16 days and cost the Soviet Union approximately 80,000 dead. German military and civilian dead will never be precisely known. Estimates range from 100,000 to 300,000. The uncertainty itself is a kind of verdict.
Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The document signed at Reims on May 7th, ratified in Berlin on May 8th, to satisfy Soviet insistence on a German signature on Soviet soil. The war in Europe was over. The Wehrmacht, which had gone to war in September 1939 as an instrument of continental conquest and had reached from the Atlantic to within sight of Moscow, from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara, ceased to exist. Not in defeat in the conventional sense, not pushed back to its borders and forced to negotiate, but consumed, absorbed into captivity, into death, into the rubble of the country it had been fighting to defend and simultaneously destroying. The final human cost is still not fully computable. German military dead, approximately 5 million. German civilian deaths between 1 and 2 million. Soviet military dead, approximately 8 to 9 million. Soviet civilian deaths, somewhere between 16 and 20 million. Poland lost roughly a fifth of its entire pre-war population. Across Europe, from the Atlantic to the Urals, the war that Germany had started in 1939 had killed between 70 and 85 million people. The Wehrmacht soldiers who survived, millions of them in Allied prisoner of war camps, millions more in Soviet camps where conditions ranged from harsh to lethal, began the slow, disorienting process of returning to a country that needed to become something it had never been before. Many did not return for years. Those held in Soviet captivity sometimes waited until 1955 or 1956. Some did not return at all. The institutions that had ordered their service, the SS, the Nazi Party, the command structures that had directed the extermination camps alongside the tank battles, faced judgment at Nuremberg. The Wehrmacht itself was the subject of an enduring and unresolved historical argument. The degree to which ordinary soldiers bore responsibility for the crimes committed in the name of the war they were fighting. That argument has not been settled. It may never be. There's a letter in the German Federal Archive, written by a soldier named Klaus Becker, a corporal from Württemberg, 20 years old, dated May 7, 1945, from an American prisoner of war camp somewhere in Bavaria. He writes to his mother, assuming the letter will reach her, not knowing whether she is alive. He writes that the apple trees must be blooming by now, back home, near the farmhouse where he was born. He writes that he wants to come home and work in the fields and never hear the word front again. He writes that he is ashamed, but he is not sure of exactly what, only that the shame is settled in him, like something physical, like the cold that had lived in his bones since the winter of 1941. He writes, "I think we marched very far in the wrong direction. I hope we can find our way back." He survived the war. He went home. He worked his farm. He did not speak of the war for 40 years. Whether he found his way back, whatever that means for a man who carried what he carried, is something only he ever knew. But the apple trees bloomed. Spring came, as it always does, indifferent to what has happened beneath it, offering the same unearned gift it offers every year, the possibility that something might begin again.